New Falcons GM Ian Cunningham was saying all the right things in his introductory presser.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to another episode of Locked On Falcons, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the #1 sports podcast network in all of the Milky Way galaxy. And of course, I'm your humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka the iron that sharpens the iron. Been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong here on Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. And on today's daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, we will be continuing our positional reviews, looking at the linebacker position, talking about how Divine Diablo was kind of the indicator on how the Falcons defense would perform overall. We'll discuss the pretty simple choice when it comes to deciding whether or not the Falcons should resign Kaden Elliss this offseason, the need for the team to really shore up their linebacker depth. But we got to start today's episode with the conversation talking about Ian Cunningham's introductory presser and my takeaways from that, and went into the presser wanting to hear Ian talk about his vision, wanting to hear him talk about how he has a data-driven approach, meaning that the Falcons are going to, draft based off of taking swings and having at bats, as opposed to, we're just going to be able to knock it out of the park every single time that we get up to the plate. And oh boy, did Ian Cunningham, he checked all those boxes for me, right? And the first part early in the presser that really made me kind of do the DJ Khaled stand up in your seat, meme, was when he said, we want to build through the trenches. And again, you love to hear that. That's one of the benefits of hiring a former offensive lineman for your general manager. He's never going to neglect the offensive line. He also talked about how he wants his philosophy is going to be to draft, develop, and retain. And that's a similar philosophy that we had under Thomas Dimitroff. And I know Thomas Dimitroff is a bad word in terms of a lot of Falcon fans, but he's by far the most successful Falcons general manager, and getting back to that philosophy is by no means a bad thing, right? We've talked about, on those notes, about how the Falcons have some pressing needs at wide receiver and cornerback. And today we're going to get into the linebacker needs at that position. But we also talked 2 weeks ago before the Senior Bowl about their need on the offensive line. And we spent the last 2 days on today's on the Locked On Falcons podcast talking about their needs at edge and D tackle and whatnot, right? And we know that those aforementioned positions like wide receiver and cornerback, et cetera, they need a plug and play sort of starter at those positions. But, I wouldn't be upset. And I don't know about you, but I wouldn't be upset if they decided to maybe punt on one of those positions. Wide receiver is probably the one I would choose of those two in terms of wide receiver versus cornerback, in favor of, drafting a quality trench player instead early on, right? If that was the case, and Shannon Sharp's word is like, that ain't no problem. That ain't no problem. And so that's what we get to when we talk about the vision of what they want to build here in Atlanta. And everybody has a vision. Every GM out there, every person has a vision, right? I have a vision of having the world's greatest podcast out there. But, ultimately you being able to see through your vision is about execution. And of course, time is going to tell on Ian Cunningham and the Falcons' new regime's ability to execute on that vision, but you love to hear about it, right? And it's really about building the type of team that you want. And again, that's going to be ongoing conversation and discussion as we unpack that all offseason long, but it'll be interesting to see, what my vision is, what your vision is, what their vision is for this Falcon team. All will probably differ, but we'll see how that all comes together. Now, another thing that stood out in this presser, and anybody knows me knows that it was another moment with the DJ Khaled being, you sit up in your seat, right, where he was asked about his thoughts on the Falcons roster. And he gave a generic answer to a certain extent. We know he's only been on the job for a couple of days. He hasn't really gotten into, evaluating a roster. He's just still trying to figure out where he puts his recycling, where the coffee filters are in the building, as opposed to worrying about, how exactly this roster is. But hey, if it's a generic answer, he's giving the people what they want, at least the people as far as the host of Locked On Falcons. And I am the people, ladies and gentlemen. But, he talked about the roster, and how the cupboard isn't bare, but they're going to continue to add to it. And it's like, that's music to my ears, right? That's been the thing that you've been hearing me complain about on this podcast as long as it has existed, because it's been an issue, in my opinion, in this organization for 2 decades, which is complacency, that they've spent the better part of 2 decades believing that they've built the world's greatest roster, and then it, more often than not, has not lived up to that billing. And hopefully Ian Cunningham's going to come in here and not have that same sort of complacent attitude and be like, yeah, we do need to get better. Yeah, we do have some core elements, some core pieces, some good cornerstone players at key positions on both sides of the ball, but that's not enough to go out there and win a championship. And that's kind of the exercise we've been going through these last few weeks, going through each position group, and we'll continue that today at the linebacker position, but talking about some of the areas of need, some of the areas of concern. And the old general manager, and Terry Fontenot, had a habit of ignoring problems, including at the linebacker position that we'll get into later today's episode, because he didn't believe they had problems. And basically, my opinion has always been that if you want to solve a problem, you got to try. You got to take a swing, right? And in order to take those swings, you got to have assets. You got to have resources. You got to have picks. You got to have cap space. And, Ian said, I love picks when he was asked about that. He said he wants to use draft picks as currency, whether that involves trades, but he mentioned specifically swings at the plate, as you've heard me talk about that when we talk about what is good drafting and what is a good draft strategy and philosophy and whatnot. And he talked specifically about how the Falcons only have 5 picks currently, but sort of likened that to when he got the job as the assistant GM with Ryan Poles in Chicago back in 2022. The Bears only had 5 picks then too, and they found a way to turn that into 10 picks in that first draft. And, going back and looking it up, and I was like, oh yeah, he's not wrong. I didn't, thank you for hipping me to this, Ian. And looking back at that draft, that 22 draft, the Bears traded back a bunch in round 5 and picked up a bunch of 6th and 7th round picks in order to do that. And that's music to our ears. Again, trade backs are, we'd love to see it. We've been complaining on this podcast for basically 4 years about all the trade ups that the Falcons have done under the old general manager. But you look at that 22 Bears draft and you could look at those late round picks and you're like, oh, they didn't really hit on a lot of those picks. But I always say there's no shame in taking a swing. Right? You're not going to get a hit if you don't take a swing. And that's ultimately the issue. And that's why my philosophy is, the GM hire and Ian Cunningham is going to be so critical to this team's success moving forward. You've heard me, several times, much to your chagrin, poo-pooing this Kevin Stefanski coaching staff. Not because I think they're bums or anything like that, but it's just because as someone who has covered this team for 20 years, who has gone through now the 6th coaching change in that period of time, I see this every single time we make a coaching change. We do this every single time. We sit here and we say, oh, the previous coaches were terrible and the new one is great. And it's like the new one is going to be better at certain things than the previous one, just like the previous one's going to be better at certain things than the new one. The reality of the situation that I've learned over the last 20 years, and with 5 out of these 6 coaching changes, I'll leave Mike Smith aside. I'll give Mike Smith his flowers. But the rest of these coaches that, whether it's Jim Moore or Bobby Petrino, or Dan Quinn or Arthur Smith and Raheem Morris and now Kevin Stefanski, is that all these coaches, we'll see if Kevin Stefanski can prove me wrong. But for the most part, all these coaches are varying degrees of mid. And every time we say, well, this time we hired this coach and it's going to be different this time. And you got to go out there and prove it for me. That's basically where I'm at, where I have seen this story and I've seen this movie before. I was like, oh, this time it's going to be different with this coaching staff and they're going to be so much better than the previous coaching staff. And I'm just like, prove it. You don't get the benefit of doubt when you're the Atlanta Falcons, and I've experienced and you've seen the various coaching hires that they've had over the last 20 years. They haven't all been disasters like a Bobby Petrino, but for the most part, it's been varying degrees of mid. And this is the reality where and why the GM hire matters, right? Because when we look at Kevin Stefanski's tenure in Cleveland, what do we know? Simple as this, guys. He was successful in Cleveland when he had a good roster. He was unsuccessful in Cleveland when he didn't. When you want to talk about Tommy Rees and Tanner Engstrand, right? And give them a pass for the poor offenses they've coached in Cleveland and New York and elsewhere these past couple of years. Why are you giving them a pass? Because they lacked talent. And so you're sitting there saying, in order for these guys to be successful, they have to be coaching talent, which is the purview of the general manager. And so when we actually sit down and say, this time it actually is going to be different, it's going to be different because the Atlanta Falcons build a better roster. And that is what Ian Cunningham's mission is going to be, that to take this stocked cupboard, right, and fully stock it. This partially stocked cupboard, fully stock that thing. And now, moving forward over the next several months and several years, he's going to have to go out there and prove it, right? This is the vision. Fully stocked cupboard. We all can sit here and picture, you open those pantry doors, the lights come on, the wind blows, the wind blows in your hair, right? And you see this fully stocked cupboard. That's the vision. Now you got to go out there and stock it. So go out there and do it. We'll see if Ian Cunningham and company can do it. One of the parts of that sections of the cupboard, I guess you could say, is a linebacker section devoted to linebackers. And we'll get into that, talking first about Divine Diablo and how the stats kind of show that based off of how Divine Diablo played last year is how the Falcons defense played, and whether or not that's going to be a factor moving forward as Ian Cunningham tries to restock this cupboard moving forward. And we'll get into that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So wouldn't it be nice if doing your taxes was just as easy as handing the ball off to Bijan Robinson? It is with TurboTax Full Service. You can hand off your taxes to a local expert and not have to stress from start to finish. It's like handing off to Bijan and letting him cook. Instead of spending hours trying to figure out your forms, you can meet with a local TurboTax expert in person or connect online. They're going to handle everything from your W-2s to your self-employment forms. They're going to work to get you every deduction, upload your documents, go about the rest of your day, and you can get updates right in the TurboTax app. It's a huge time saver. It's going to give you peace of mind that you get from an expert handling, just like you get watching Bijan Robinson play football. So for a limited time, get your taxes done by a local TurboTax expert for just $150 all in. If a TurboTax expert didn't file for you last year, just file by February 28th. Take taxes off your plate and get back to your life by visiting turbotax.com/local to book your appointment today. This episode is also sponsored by BetterHelp. Now, February can be a lot, flowers, candy, stuffed animals, and so much talk about relationships. And it can honestly feel like everyone else has it together in their love life. But here's the truth. Whether you're married, dating, single, or just focusing on you, most people are still figuring it out. And no matter where you are in your romantic journey, therapy can help you find your way. It can help you get clear on what you want, what feels heavy, and how to take some pressure off yourself. It's easy to assume that everyone else has that perfect relationship, but most people are working through something, and therapy can help you recognize the patterns that might be weighing your relationships down. It can help you communicate better, set healthier boundaries, and stop carrying everything alone. And even if you're not in a relationship right now, therapy can help you feel more confident in wanting what you want moving forward. So BetterHelp has licensed therapists across the U.S. They do the initial matching work for you so you can focus on your goals. And if you want to switch therapists, you can do so at any time. Sign up and get 10% off at betterhelp.com/lockedon. That's BetterHelp.com/lockedon. So before we continue today's Locked On Falcons, I want to plug the Everydayer Club. For those of you that make Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day, we thank you. You're the reason why Locked On is now the #1 sports podcast network in the galaxy. But you can level up by joining the Everydayer Club, and you can get some exclusive Locked On Podcast Network Discord access, and you can interact with Everydayers from various other NFL teams. You want to get out there and talk some trash to some Saints fans. You want to get out there and get direct insight onto upcoming draft prospects from the Locked On college hosts that have been covering these players for the last 3, 4, 5 years. You can do so at the Locked On Falcons or Locked On Podcast Network Discord server, which you get as part of several other perks that you get by joining the Everydayer Club. It's $5 a month, $50 a year at the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. So let's talk linebackers and let's talk Divine Diablo, right? And let's talk about how Divine Diablo played outstanding for the first 5 games. He played at an elite level. And then he got injured, broke his forearm, and missed 4 games. And then he came back for the final 7, if I'm not mistaken. My math right? Yeah. Oh, he played great for the first 5 games, got injured in the 6th game, missed the next 4 games, and then came back for the last 7. Okay. It's like, that only adds up to 16. You can't do math and podcasts at the same time. But he came back for the last 7, and he wasn't the same elite player. He still played well, and it was reflected in him being a little bit less effective in coverage, right? And I got some graphics for those of you that are watching on YouTube. For the audio listeners, you can come check it out on YouTube, but I'll describe the sort of broad strokes. The key to pay attention to on your screens is the success rate allowed pre-injury. Divine Diablo coverage, and this is based off my own charting of the Falcons defense last year. Divine Diablo allowed a success rate of 33% before his injury. That's an elite coverage grade for a linebacker. I recall, like, I think Deion Jones back in like 2019 had something around that, and that's probably like the best coverage I'd seen all, since starting the defense back in 2019. But then when he came back from his injury, starting in week 12, his success rate allowed was about 52%. Now, that's still a solid number, especially for a linebacker. And so he finished the season with about a 49% success rate allowed overall. But one of the other things you saw pre-injury, he was rarely getting targeted, on average about one time per game. And when teams did target him, he made them pay. You can see on your screens a force incompletion rate. And force incompletion rates in terms of my charting mostly corresponds to pass breakups, but it also it involves other instances of tight coverage where you can prevent a defender prevents a catch, and that force incompletion rate for Divine Diablo pre-injury was 50%, which is incredible. Post-injury, he was targeted about 4 times a game, and his force incompletion rate was about 11%, which is still extremely good for a linebacker. Like, that would be solid for a cornerback. That would be a good number for a corner. And so the fact that a linebacker was able to do that is a testament to Divine Diablo playing well after his injury. And so want to make it clear, it's not to say that he was by any means bad, but he did come back down a little bit to earth from that elite level that he had in the first 5+ games, where the Falcons defense was also playing at a high level. And we've discussed this before about sort of the roller coaster that this Falcons defense had, and it correlated very much to Divine Diablo's play. That when he was playing at an elite level for those first 6 weeks of the season, right through week 6, through that Bills game, when he was healthy, the Falcons defense overall was 6th in EPA allowed in the season on defense. Then for the next several weeks, starting in that 49ers game when he got injured in basically at the first quarter through that Carolina game in week 11, the Falcons defense was 27th. So they went from a top 6 defense to a bottom 6 defense based entirely off of Divine Diablo playing at an elite level or not being absent or not being on the field at all. And then when he came back from week 12 on, the Falcons defense rebounded to about that middle of the level, settled in at 15th in EPA over the last 7 games of the season. And so, will Divine Diablo be the sort of guiding light for this Falcons defense moving forward in perpetuity? Probably not. But it does sort of indicate that, like, Divine Diablo missing time is a challenge for this team. And it's why we're going to talk later about their need to add depth to make sure that this isn't an issue before, right? If it does wind up becoming an issue where it's like, oh, when Divine Diablo is on the field, they're a top defense. When he's not, they're a bad defense, right? Because Divine Diablo, over the course of his career, averages about 13.4 games played per season, right? He hasn't played a full 17-game slate since his 2021 rookie season, right? And so that basically means he's going to, on average, miss up to a month of the season. And so you don't want to see this defense, if this trend continues into the future, you don't want to see this defense fall off a cliff for a month, right? If the goal is to make the playoffs, like, a month of bottom 5, bottom 6 defense is going to be the difference between you winning and not making or making the playoffs. And so the Falcons are going to need more help at linebacker to supplement Divine Diablo, assuming that he's going to continue to play probably more at the level that we saw in the back half of the season, which is still a very good linebacker, but by no means elite. And so adding that help at linebacker is going to be potentially a priority this offseason. Supplementing Divine Diablo is, of course, Kaden Elliss, the Falcons, middle linebacker, the man that wears the green dot, the leader, one of the leaders of their defense, but he is an impending free agent. And there's going to be a debate over this coming weeks between now and the start of free agency on the decision on whether or not the Falcons should re-sign him. And I think that debate really comes down to one simple question, and it's really about what is your vision, what is your identity for what you want this defense to be, and we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So it's a new year, which means it's time to simplify. One way to do that is with easy, reliable dinner plans. And that's why I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Home Chef. They're going to take the stress out of cooking by delivering fresh, pre-proportioned ingredients right to your door with easy-to-follow recipes that actually taste great. They're rated #1 by users of other meal kits for quality, convenience, value, taste, and recipe ease. And it's easy to see why, because their meals come ready to fit your schedule with a wide variety of options, from family-sized meals to quick lunches. And there are plenty of options that are going to fit different dietary choices. So, and if you're looking to save time and money, Home Chef has got you. Customers will save an average of $86 per month on groceries. So right now, you can get 50% off your first box with free shipping and free dessert for life by going to homechef.com/locked on. That's homechef.com/locked on for 50% off your first box, free shipping, and free dessert for life. And you must be an active subscriber to receive that free dessert. And let's be real. When you started your business, tax withholdings and managing payroll spreadsheets was the last thing on your mind. But thankfully, there's Gusto to take the stress out of payroll, benefits, and HR so you can focus on running your business and supporting your team. Gusto is an all-in-one remote-friendly payroll and HR platform that makes managing your team simple, transparent, and fast. Whether you're hiring, onboarding, or paying employees, Gusto is going to help you do it all from one place without the hassle or the hidden fees. Gusto will save you hours each week with their automated tools for offer letters, onboarding materials, and direct deposits. And you'll get real peace of mind knowing you can reach a certified HR expert anytime you need it. Try Gusto today at gusto.com/lockedonnfl and get 3 months free when you run your first payroll. That's right, 3 months of free payroll at gusto.com/lockedonnfl. One more time, that's gusto.com/lockedonnfl. So let's talk about Kaden Elliss. And to me, Kaden Elliss is very underrated in coverage. He's very underrated in run defense. He's by no means elite in either of those categories, but I think he often gets labeled by Falcon fans that I talk to a lot as like he's bad at those things. And it's like he's more than competent, right? He might be a 5.9 out of 10, right? But like that's pretty much the norm across the league for quality linebackers. And particularly when it comes to the coverage element, I think that's reflected in the stats, right? We talked about how Divine Diablo finished the season with a 49% success rate allowed in coverage this past year. Well, Kaden Elliss finished the season with a 47% success rate allowed, right? And particularly in the latter part of the season, upon Divine Diablo's return, it was in fact Kaden Elliss that was the more reliable, more productive coverage guy based off of my charting. And again, it's not to suggest that Kaden Elliss is a better coverage linebacker than Divine Diablo. When we play the Detroit Lions this year, we're not putting Kaden Elliss on Jahmyr Gibbs, right? That's going to be a Divine Diablo job. But it is one of those things where I think it does illustrate that Kaden Elliss doesn't get enough credit for having an all-around linebacker skill set. But at the same time, we know he's so good at pass rushing that I think a lot of people look at his other skills and be like, oh, he's bad at those things. And it's like, he's not bad at those things. He's good at those things, or at least above average at those things. He's just so really good at pass rushing. However, this year, his pass rushing sort of tailed off at the end of the season. Now, he was really good for the first 2 months of the season. He was, in fact, the best pass rusher on the team for the first 2 months of the season over guys like James Pierce and Jalen Walker and Leonard Floyd, et cetera, right? If you needed someone to win, it was Kaden Elliss that was consistently winning over those first 2 months. And that was reflected in his pressure rate. Through week 11, he had about 24 pressures, which was leading all off-ball linebackers in the NFL through that period of time with a 22% pressure rate. And he was rushing about 11 times per game through those first 10 games of the season. But then starting in week 12, which also coincided with Divine Diablo's return to the lineup, his pressure production fell off, right? He only had 6 pressures in those final 7 games, which is still good for a off-ball linebacker. I think it was like top 12 among off-ball linebackers during that stretch, but by no means the usual standard that we've seen from Kaden Elliss with a 10% pressure rate and rushing about 8 times per game. And when you look at his combined pressure rate in 23 and 24, it's about 29%. And this year overall, when you factor in all the games, it fell off to 18%. And so basically, when we have the conversation about should you re-sign Kaden Elliss, right, it boils down to a simple answer. If you're going to be committed to rushing him and blitzing him 10 to 12 times per game, then he's worth paying. If your goal instead is to build a 4-man pass rush, which is one of the things that the Falcons were trying to do over those last 7 games, starting in that week 12 game against the Saints, right, then there's really no point to pay Kaden Elliss, right? He's at that point just an expensive bridge to get you to that point, right? That you may not be there right now, but eventually you want to get there, right? And so it's instead, to me, smarter if you're the Atlanta Falcons, if that's the goal, right? To build that 4-man pass rush and be able to rely on 4 guys to spend that money elsewhere that's going to help you reach that goal, as opposed to Kaden Elliss, if you're not going to be committed to trying to replicate what he was in the first half of the season, which is rushing the quarterback and blitzing a dozen times or more per game. And that's what we talk about with this vision of this football team, right? We can have an endless debate about Kaden Elliss and his age and his costs and the potential decline and his character and his leadership and all these things, all the pros and cons that Kaden Elliss brings, but you don't need to really have that conversation. It's simple. What is your vision for this football team? If you want to rush with 4, you're better off spending that money elsewhere. If you want to be neck and neck with Brian Flores for the blitz happiest defense in the NFL, then by all means, in the words of Kaden Elliss, in the words of Teddy KGB from the 20th century cinematic masterpiece Rounders, when it comes to Kaden Elliss, pay that man his money. So that's really what it boils down to. It's about, what is your vision for the Falcons defense? 4-man rush, let Kaden Elliss walk and draft his replacement. If you're committed to a 5-man rush, then pay that man his money. Now, when we talk about the rest of the Falcons linebacker core, let's talk about J.D. Bertrand, often the punchy back for the Falcons. There were some positives this year, but not enough. Not enough by all means. Far outweighed by the negatives, right? And essentially it boils down to the Falcons try to make it work with him as a depth piece. It didn't work, and they should move on. And when I say move on, I don't mean they need to cut him or whatever. He's a okay special teams player, but he should be a roster bubble player entering camp. And if he plays well in camp and earns a roster spot, can be a depth guy, play special teams and contribute there, then he should be on the roster this year. If not, then you move on. And we saw the Falcons carrying 5 linebackers on their active roster last year, if you count Ronnie Harrison as a linebacker. And basically what I'm saying is J.D. Bertrand at best should be the 5th guy, that last guy in the hierarchy of linebackers, which means to me, you need to add 3 linebackers this offseason, right? Devine Diablo is going to be one of the 4 above J.D. Bertrand in this hypothetical scenario. The number 2 guy is going to either be Kaden Elliss or the guy that you add to replace Kaden Elliss as a starter. And then you probably need to add 2 backups to be that 3rd and 4th guy. And then J.D. Bertrand's that 5th guy, right? And J.D. Bertrand should be competing for that 5th spot. Troy Anderson could be in the mix, maybe not for the 3rd or 4th spot, but potentially for that 5th spot. He's a free agent. If he's healthy, if he's willing to play on close to vet minimum contract, then I wouldn't be opposed to bringing back Troy Anderson to come back and compete for some roster spot. We know he's a good special teams player, even if you can't count on him defensively because of the durability concerns. But again, mostly you're talking about competition, bolstering competition. And we'll see if that's the case. Josh Woods, Ronnie Harrison are also free agents. They're in a similar boat. I think worth bringing back to compete. But Harrison's going to be age 29. Woods is going to be age 30 this upcoming season. I think both of these guys are 1-year stopgaps. For me, I'm not necessarily interested in band-aiding this solution. I want to solve this problem that has been a problem for the Falcons, the lack of linebacker depth, which has been a problem for the Falcons for 3 years now, right? And we talked about this last offseason. The Falcons had a need at linebacker. They signed Divine Diablo, and we basically said, well, you kind of have to punt on linebacker because this is part of the challenge of having limited resources. You have bigger fish to fry, and you figure with Divine Diablo, Kaden Elliss, J.D. Bertrand, Troy Anderson, you can kind of make it work at linebacker. Josh Woods as well. You can kind of figure it out, right? But this is the challenge and the problem of Terry Fontenot, and this is why we sit here and we blame Terry Fontenot. Not to say we blame him for all the team's problems, but we sit here and we go, his philosophy of team building was really about ignoring problems and necessarily solving problems, because this team constantly had limited resources. And so they constantly had to play this shuffle of like, well, we only have 5 draft picks, so we can really only address 5 problems, but we actually have 8 problems, linebacker being one of those problems, but we kind of have to ignore this problem because we don't have enough assets to do it. And again, one of the hopes that we have from Ian Cunningham is that his philosophy of trading back and accumulating draft assets and having those picks as currency is going to be that's going to allow you to solve some of these problems that you have been ignoring for the last couple of years. And so we'll see how the Falcons approach that. Their linebacker depth, J.D. Bertrand, et cetera, isn't the only reason that tanked this defense. The lack of a CB2 was not the only reason it tanked the defense, but these were problems that the Falcons predominantly ignored last offseason, and they played a huge part in some of the struggles that the defense had. And the people that bet on J.D. Bertrand and this linebacker depth, the people that bet on Mike Hughes as a CB2, Terry Fontenot, Raheem Morris, they're out of a job. And that's part of the reason, right? There are consequences, right? Ripple effects to every decision that you make. And unfortunately for them, they suffered the consequences of that with some of the limitations of this defense, as we saw them in that middle section of the season, where we discussed it constantly during the season, which is J.D. Bertrand and Mike Hughes were liabilities during that 4-game stretch when the Falcons were a bottom 5, bottom 6 defense, and opposing offenses were just going at those guys. Now, we're going to spend a lot of time on tomorrow's episode talking corners, talking about that CB2 issue. We'll probably spend like a minute talking about, hey, AJ Terrell, he's pretty good, right? Although I know there's going to be some of you guys out there, oh, he's overrated. I'm kidding. We'll get into that. But, we'll break down the cornerbacks tomorrow on the podcast. We'll still continue to unpack some of the Ian Cunningham stuff as the week unfolds. Maybe we'll talk about the Bears' tendency to draft Senior Bowl and All-Star game guys potentially on tomorrow's episode, which is, part of the reason why I was like, you heard me say last week on the pod, I thought this year is going to be my last year at the Senior Bowl, just because I was like, I don't know if there's a reason for me to come here if they're not going to invest in Senior Bowl guys, but doing the research, it's like moving forward with the new GM. We know Terry and them were always about, All-Star game guys, but the Bears were also all about All-Star game guys. So I don't think that's going to change. And we can potentially unpack that on tomorrow's episode, as well as talk corners. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Check us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. In order to do so, check out Locked On NFL to get you guys geared up for this weekend's big game, as well as other breaking news around the league. And of course, check out the link in the description below to be an everydayer and join the Everydayer Club at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com. $5 a month or $50 a year. You can get premium Locked On Discord access, ad-free version of Locked On Falcons, as well as sweet Locked On merch. So go check it out. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.